Hi everyone, welcome back to the NestJS full course. This is Sakura Dev channel and today we will be covering role-based authorization in NestJS. So let's get started. Alright, before moving to our NestJS project, let me explain real quick the 3 steps that we are going to do in this video. First, we are going to add a role field to our user entity which determines the role of the user. It can be, for example, user, editor, or admin. And then we are going to create a role decorator. We're going to use this role decorator in our API route, which actually determines the required roles of an API. For example, we can set the required role of an API to admin, so only admin users can access that API. Or we can set it to admins and editors, so only admin and editors can access that API. And third, we are going to create a role guard, which actually checks the user role to see if the role of the user is one of the required roles of a certain API. So if the user has one of the required roles, it will allow the user to access that API. Otherwise, it rejects the user request with an unauthorized error. So with these 3 main steps in your mind, let's get to our NestJS project and start implement them. Alright, in the first step, let's create a role enum, which actually defines the roles in our application. So here in the auth module, I'm going to create a directory called enums, and then inside it, we're going to create a role.enum.ts. Alright, to speed up the process, let me just paste the code for creating the role enum. We're going to name it role, and inside we're going to define admin, editor, and also the user. So our user role can be one of these 3 roles that we have defined in the role enum. Now let's go to our user entity and create a role field in that entity. So I go to the entities directory and I go to the user entity, and here after the password, we're going to create another column and we're going to call it role and set its type to the role enum that we have just created in the role.enum file. All right, here in the column decorator, we're going to set a configuration object, and here we're going to set the type. We're going to set it to enum. All right, and then we're going to specify the enum and set it to role enum that we have just imported from the role.enum file. And since we have already some records inside our user table, we need to set a default value for this field for those existing records inside the user table. So here we're going to specify the default and set it to role.user. So all of the existing users in our user table now have the user role. All right, now we need to set the required roles for each API that we are going to enforce the authorization on. For example, let's go to the user module and then open up the user controller. Let's say that we are going to just allow the admin user to call this delete API. So we need to find a way to set the required role for this API, which is admin. In order to do that, we can use the @setMetadata decorator. So here you can call the @setMetadata, which comes from the NestJS/common, and then define a key here, for example, role, and under the role key, let's say we are going to pass a list that contains the required roles of this API. For example, we can say role enum.admin. So in this way, we can add a key value in the metadata of this API route and set our required roles. But let's be more specific and create a custom decorator for setting the metadata of the role key. So in order to do that, I go to the auth module and then create a decorators directory. And then inside it, we're going to create a roles.decorator.ts. All right, now inside it, we are going to create our custom decorator for setting the metadata of the role key. So here I'm going to export a function. I'm going to call it roles, and then it is going to be a function. It takes the roles, which is going to be a list of role enum, and then we're going to call the set metadata function, which comes from the NestJS/common, and specify the key. We're going to set it to roles, and then we're going to just pass the roles parameter. So let's import the roles enum. All right, in this way we can set the metadata under the roles key for any API that we want to enforce authorization on. Later, we can extract these roles under the key roles to find out what are the required roles for any specific API. So we need to memorize this roles key in order to be able to access to these roles of each API. So let's save this roles key in a constant and then export it from this file. So here I'm going to say export const roles key and then set it to roles. And instead of just hard coding the roles here, we're going to use this constant that we have just created. Now we can use this roles decorator to set the required roles for any specific API. So let's get back to user controller, and on this delete route, instead of this set metadata function, we can use @roles decorator, which comes from the roles.decorator file that we have just created, and then we can pass a list inside it, and inside it we can specify the authorized role that can access this API. And here, since this is a list, we can pass more than one role, for example editor, so not only the admin but also the editors can access this delete API. Alright, now let's make some changes to the roles decorator so it can actually accept the authorized role directly in the parameters, so we don't have to put them inside a list. So as you can see, we can't do this right now, but we can go to the roles decorator and here use the rest operator on the roles parameter. So it means that the roles decorator can accept any number of roles which are then collected into an array named roles. So if I save this and get back to the user controller, we can have more than one roles directly into the parameters, so we don't need to put them inside a list here. Alright, now let's make another change to the role decorator to make it even better. So as you can see here, if we pass an empty parameter list here, we don't have an error. This is not ideal because we don't want to have an empty list in our roles decorator. So in order to fix that, I go back to the roles decorator, and here, in order to avoid accepting an empty list, we're going to change the type of the roles array. So we're going to just remove the roles type here, and then we're going to combine the TypeScript tuples and array types in order to avoid accepting a empty array. So we're going to set its type to a tuple that the first element should be of type role, and then any subsequent elements, if any, are also of type role. So we're going to use the spread operator here and then pass an array of the roles. Alright, this type now ensures that we're going to have a list of roles enum, and we should have at least one member inside that list. Alright, so if I go to the user controller, we can see we cannot pass an empty list inside the roles decorator. So we need to pass at least one roles inside it. We can also put more than one member inside the parameters list of this roles parameter. Alright, that's it for the roles decorator. And now we are going to create a role guard. So we can use the role guard inside the use guards for any of our APIs. And then inside it, we are going to extract the required roles that we have set inside the roles decorator for a specific API. And after that, we're going to check if the role of the user that is calling the API is matched to one of these required roles that we have set inside the roles decorator. So now let's create the roles guard. But before moving forward, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to like this. Your support means a lot and helps me create more content like this. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. And if you think this video could help someone you know, feel free to share this video. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this channel. So now let's create the roles guard. I open up the terminal, and here I'm going to say NestJS for creating the guard, and I'm going to create it inside the auth module and then in the guards directory, and we're going to call it just roles. We can also specify the --no spec because we don't want to create the test file for this guard. Alright, now let's go to the guards directory, and as you can see, now we have a roles directory, and inside it we have the roles.guard. Alright, so let's open it and let's close the terminal. Okay, this guard is different from the previous guard that we have just extend one of the passport auth guard. Instead, we are going to create this role guard from scratch. So as you can see, it just implements the canActivate class. So it should have a canActivate function. Inside the canActivate function, if we return true, we allow the user to access the protected resource. Otherwise, for example, if we return false from this function, this guard throws a new exception called forbidden exception. So it actually doesn't allow the user to access the protected resource that we have enforced these roles guard on that. Alright, so we we need to implement our logic here inside this can activate function. Actually, we are going to extract the required roles of our API from the metadata and then check if the role of the user is equal to one of these required roles. So in the first step inside this can activate function, we need to extract the required roles from the metadata. So in order to do that, we need to use the reflector class. Therefore, we need to inject the reflector class into this class. So here in the constructor, I'm going to say private reflector and set its type to the reflector class that comes from the NestJS/core, and then put the body of the constructor. All right, now we can use this reflector inside the can activate function. So here, let's just remove these two types from the return type of the can activate function because it just return a boolean. And then inside this function, let me just remove this return true. First, we're going to use the reflector to extract the required roles from the metadata. So here, I'm going to say const required roles. You can call it authorized roles. They are the same. All right. You can set this required roles to this reflector that get all and override function. I'm going to explain this function in a second. And here we can specify a generics, which actually the type of the object that we are going to extract from the metadata. It is actually a list of role enum. And then in the parameter of this function, we need to provide the key that is used to set the role metadata. And we are going to extract it from the roles key constant from the roles decorator. All right, so we're going to use the roles key constant. As you can see, it comes from the roles decorator. And then we need to pass a list here in which we're going to specify where we are going to extract the metadata. So if I go back to the user controller here, you can see we have set the metadata for this route handler. We can also use the roles decorator to set the metadata directly on the controllers, just like this, and then pass the required roles here in the parameter. All right. So once again, we can set the metadata for the entire controller class, or we can set the metadata directly on the route handler. And here, this is crucial to note that the metadata that we have set on the handler has a higher priority over the metadata that we have set on the controller class. So if we set the roles metadata here for the controller class to, for example, roles.user, and then for one of the route handler, we set the roles to role.admin, the metadata of the role key of all the handlers inside this controller class will be set to role.user, except this one, which will be set as role.admin. So as I said, if we set metadata directly on the route handler, it has a higher priority. All right, so let's get back to the role guards here. And here, now we know that we are going to extract the metadata from the handlers and also from the class. So we're going to use the context, which we have here in the parameter of the can activate function, and then call the get handler function and also pass the context that get class. All right. So we are going to extract the role metadata from the handler and also from the class. And then this get all and override function first looks for the metadata under the role key inside the entire class. And if any specific handler has its own metadata on the roles key, it actually override that metadata for that handler. That's why we call it get all and override. All right. So I hope this makes sense for you. Actually, for this line, we are going to extract the required roles that we have set inside the roles decorator from the specific route that we are going to use this role guard for. Now that we have the required roles, we need to check the role of the user. So first we need to access to the user itself. Okay, so I'm going to say const user, and we're going to extract the user from the request object. So here we're going to say context that switch to HTTP because our API routes are actually HTTP endpoints, and then get request function. And from the request, we are going to access to the user object. So if I go back to the JWT strategy in our strategy directory, you can see it returns an object that contains the ID of the user. Actually, as I said in the previous episode, this object will be appended to the request object under the property name user. So that's why we are going to extract the user from the property user here. And you might have noticed here that if we are going to access to the user property from the request, first we need to mark our API with the JWT guard. So it finally creates a user object and append that object to the request object for this API. Otherwise, we can't access to the user property from the request. All right, now we need to check the role of the user. But here, as you can see, we just return an object that contains the ID of the user. We do not include the role of the user here in this object. So we're going to go back here in a minute and retrieve the role of the user from our database and put it inside this return object from the validate function of the JWT strategy. So for now, just suppose that our user has an ID and a role inside it. We're going to handle that after this section. All right, now that we have the user object, we're going to check if the user has one of the required roles. So here I'm going to say const has required role and then call the required roles that we have here. So it has a typo, so let's fix that. All right, and fix this here. Now we can call the sum function. So as you know here, sum function takes a callback and loop through all of the members of the required roles list. And if that callback returns true for at least one of the list member, the sum function finally returns true. Otherwise, it returns false. So we are going to check if one of the required roles here is equal to the user role. If that's the case, we're going to return true. So let me pass the callback. It takes the role and then return user.role is equal to the role parameter here in the callback. So again, if the role of the user is matched with one of the required roles inside this list, this function returns true, otherwise it returns false. So we can just return the has required role constant, which actually determines whether the user can access to the API or not. All right, we're almost done here, but our user object does not have a role inside it because the JWT strategy just returned an object that has only the ID of the user. So now let's get back to our user controller. First, we are going to use the use guard with the JWT auth guard. So it looks for the JWT inside the header of the request, and then finally append the user object to the request object of this API. And then we are going to use the role guard. So here above the JWT guard, again, we're going to use the use guard, and then this time we're going to use roles guard here. So make sure that the JWT auth guard must be closer to our API. So here, let me explain why we need to put the JWT guard after the roles guard. Here we have the remove function. With this delete decorator, the remove function actually will be passed as a callback to the delete decorator here. Then this delete function will be passed as a callback to this use guard. So first the JWT auth guard will be run, and then this whole section will be passed as a callback to this role use guard that we have here. So the JWT auth guard will be run first, and then roles guard will be run. If we put the role guard after the JWT guard, we cannot access to the user object from the request. So again, make sure to use the JWT auth guard closer to our final target function. All right, so let's open up our terminal and run our server. Okay, the application is running, and we can go to Insomnia to test this API. And here, as you can see, we have a delete user request, which sends a delete request to the /user, and then this is the ID of the user. So as you can see, our auth header is empty, and if I send the request, obviously we get an unauthorized exception because this route is guarded with the JWT auth guard. So we need to provide an access token here. So first, let me go to the login API, and with this email and password, let's log in into our application and just copy the access token. And first, let me go to the profile API, and here in the auth header, paste the access token and send the request to see the role of this user. So we don't have the role of the user, so let's get back to the VS Code, and here in the user service, in the find one function, we just add the role of the user inside the select list. All right, so let's save this and get back to Insomnia. If I send the request again, you can see the role of the user is user. So I just pause the video and go to the Neon console and change the role of this user to admin. All right, I'm back, and I changed the role of the user in our database. So if I send the request again, you can see now the role of the user is admin. So now let's go to the delete user and just paste the access token. And if I send the request here, you can see we've gotten forbidden error. And although the role of the user is admin, still we've gotten forbidden resource, and that's because here in the roles guard, let me close this up first, this role property of the user is undefined. So here, let me just first console log the user to see what is the problem here. All right, so let's open up the terminal and let's get back to Insomnia and send the request again. Okay, let's get back to VS Code, and here, as you can see, we have the user object, but this user object only has the ID inside it. We don't have any role property inside it. So we need to add the role property inside our JWT strategy. Okay, so let's do that. Let's close the terminal and I go to the JWT strategy. And here, instead of just returning this object, first we're going to get the user ID here. So I'm going to say const user ID and set it to payload.sub. Now we need to create a function inside our auth service, which actually retrieve the user from our database based on this user ID, and then create a user object which contains the ID of the user and also the role of the user. And then we can call that function here, get the returning object, and then return it from this validate function. So for doing that, let's create the validate JWT user function inside the auth service. So at the end of the auth service class, we're going to create a validate JWT user function. So it is going to be async validate JWT user, and it takes the user ID, which is obviously a number, and then it retrieves the user from our database based on the user ID. So here I'm going to say const user and then call the find one function of the user service. It is an async function, so we're going to use the await here and then call the this.user service that find one function and just pass the user ID inside it. All right, now we can check if the user is undefined or null. So we're going to say not user. We can just throw an unauthorized exception. So here we're going to say throw new unauthorized exception, and for example, let's say user not found. Okay, otherwise we can just create an object that contains the ID of the user and also the role of the user and just return that from this function. So here I'm going to say const current user. We can also define a type for this type of user. So here inside the types directory of the auth module, we're going to create a file and let's call it current user.d.ts. All right, inside it just export a type and let's call it current user, and it is going to be an object that contains ID, which is a number, and also a role, which its type is type role enum. All right, now we can use this type here to type the current user object. So we're going to set its type to current user, and then we're going to set an object to it that has the ID and set it to user.id, and also set its role to user.role. Now we can just return this object from this function, return current user. All right, now let's get back to the JWT strategy and just call and return the validate JWT user that we have just written. So in order to call that, first we need to inject the auth service inside the constructor of this class. So I'm going to say private auth service and set its type to the auth service class. All right, now we can use it inside the validate function, and here we just return this dot auth service that validate JWT user, and then pass the user ID that we have extracted from the JWT payload. So here, as you can see, we return object from this validate function that contains the ID of the user and also role of the user. Now let's save this, open up our terminal and go to the Insomnia, and if I send the request with the same JWT, now we can access to the protected API. If I get back to the VS Code, now you can see the role of the user inside the user object in our terminal, but the ID of the user is undefined, and that's because here in the validate JWT user, we call the find one function, and here we just don't select the ID of the user. If I save that and get back to Insomnia and send the request, get back to VS Code, open up our terminal, you can see now we have the ID of the user inside the user object in the terminal. All right, now let's change the required role of the delete API in the user controller. So for example, let's set it to role.editor and get back to Insomnia. As you can see, the role of the user is admin. If I send the request again, we've got a forbidden resource because the role of the user is not matched with the required roles of the delete API. Actually, it doesn't make sense that admin user can't access to this route, but the editor user have the access to this API. But I just wanted to show you if the role of the user doesn't match with any of the required roles of the roles decorator, we've gotten forbidden resource in the response. Alright, now before ending this video, let me do a recap real quick. Get back to VS Code. First, we've added a role field in the user entity, and then we create the roles decorator in which we set the metadata of the API routes under the key roles key. And then we have created a roles guard in which we use the reflector to extract the roles key of the metadata that we have set on the handlers and also on the controller classes. This metadata under this role key is the required role for a specific API. And then we extract the user from the request object, and then here we're going to check if the role of the user is matched with any of the required roles. If that's the case, we're going to return true, which allows the user to access that specific API. Otherwise, we'll return false here, which does not allow the user to access that specific API. Then we go to the JWT strategy and write this function for adding the role property into the user object that we are going to append to the request object from this validate function in the JWT strategy. Then as a last step, we go to one of our route handler that we are going to protect. So in this case, we just protect the delete route of the user controller. And here, as I said, make sure to use the JWT guard closer to our target function. And then after that, use the roles guard. So the JWT guard activates the JWT strategy. It actually will append the user object with its role to the request object. And then here in the roles guard, we can extract that user object from the request and then check its role. So yeah, that's it for role-based authorization. And in the next video, we are going to set the authentication globally in our application. And in the upcoming sections of this course, we are going to implement the Google OAuth authentication for our NestJS application. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell in order to get informed about the next episodes. And also, if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button. I really need your support in order to grow on YouTube. So I really appreciate all your support. All right, have a nice time and stay tuned for my next video. Bye-bye.